This video is an introduction to cost accounting. We know that trading enterprises are businesses that buy finished products at a certain price. Then they add a markup and then finally sell the products at a higher price without changing the product in any way. In other words, they simply buy it in its current form and then sell it at a higher price. The cost of the products that is now in the books of the trading enterprise is therefore simply the price they paid for the products. On the other hand, in a manufacturing enterprise, the manufacturer purchases raw materials and then transform or change the raw materials through a manufacturing process into the finished products. A markup is then added and these finished products are sold. So important is to see there's an additional step where the raw materials are transformed or changed into a finished product. In the case of the manufacturing enterprise, the cost of the products in the books of the manufacturer is determined by adding all the costs incurred in manufacturing the products. The types of manufacturing costs. Manufacturing costs are the costs that are incurred by a manufacturer when converting raw materials into the finished product. So in that process of converting raw materials to finished products, we incur the manufacturing costs. We have broadly three types, namely the material costs, like for example screws, the labor costs for the workers that are in fact transforming the material into the final products, and then manufacturing overheads, which are those costs that you can't directly observe in the item, like for example the electricity that you use. So we are going to tackle each of these three broad types one by one. Firstly, we are focusing on the material costs. So that consists of the cost of all the raw materials used in the manufacturing of a product. We can again subdivide material costs into two categories, namely the direct material costs and on the other hand the indirect material costs. Let's first focus on the direct material costs. It's a cost of raw materials used directly in the manufacture of a product. These raw materials can be identified as components of the final product. An example is the cost of the fabric, the zips and buttons used to make a dress. They are direct material costs. On the other hand, indirect material costs, it's the cost of the raw materials which are either not directly identifiable in the finished product or are a relatively insignificant part of the finished product. Indirect material cost forms part of the manufacturing overheads, on which we will focus a bit later in more detail. An example of indirect material is the oil you use to lubricate the sewing machine. That is an example of not directly identifiable in the finished product. It's not as if you're going to see the oil in the product, namely the dress. And the thread used to stitch the dress. Though you might close observation, identify the threat, it is a relatively insignificant part of the finished product. The second category of the material cost is the labor costs. So that consists of the cost of the labor involved in the manufacturing of the product. And similarly then material cost is divided into two main categories, namely direct labor costs and indirect labor costs. So firstly, the direct labor costs, it's the salaries and wages paid to the employees who are directly involved in the manufacture of a product. The work done by these employees can be directly identified in the production process. Direct labor is often referred to as touch labor because these workers generally touch the product that is being manufactured. An example is in the manufacture of a dress, the wages paid to the sewing machine operators who stitch the dress is a direct labor cost. On the other hand, indirect labor costs, it's the salaries and wages paid to employees who are not directly involved in the manufacture of a product. These employees are often involved with a range of different products, and the work done by these employees cannot be directly identified in the manufacture of a specific product. Indirect labor costs form part of the manufacturing overheads. An example would be the salary paid to a dress designer as an indirect labor cost. The third category is the manufacturing overheads, which we already made brief references when we dealt with indirect material and indirect labor. Manufacturing overheads are all the costs of the manufacturing process that are not directly identifiable with a specific product. In other words, manufacturing overheads include all the costs of production, excluding the direct material and the direct labor costs. Manufacturing overheads include costs such as indirect materials and indirect labor, water and electricity, factory rental, depreciation on machinery. So you can see it's all the costs that is not direct material cost, not direct labor cost, but has a direct bearing on the manufacturing process and therefore the costs that are involved in the manufacturing. So the water and electricity will be specifically the portion of the water and electricity that relates to manufacturing, not the part that relates to the administration portion of the business. Next, we focus on the classification of manufacturing costs. Since indirect material costs and indirect labor costs form part of manufacturing overheads, manufacturing costs are generally classified under the following three headings. Firstly, the direct material costs, secondly, the direct labor costs, and then thirdly, the manufacturing overheads. Apart from the manufacturing costs, manufacturing business should provide for the following other costs. The sales and distribution costs, that is all the costs related to selling the product and getting the product to the customers. This is the cost incurred to market and sell the product. The finance costs, this is primarily the interest on borrowed capital. Administrative costs. This is the cost incurred to run the business. The sales and distribution costs, finance costs, and administrative costs are what we refer to as period costs, and thus do not form part of the cost price of the manufactured product. So period cost is something separate from the manufacturing cost of the product. Finally, in this video, we are going to focus on the manufacturing cost calculations. We have what we refer to as prime costs. The prime cost is the total direct costs involved in the manufacturing process. The prime costs comprise of the direct material costs, the direct labor costs, and any other direct costs. So in equation form, we have prime cost is direct material costs plus direct labor costs plus other direct costs. The total manufacturing costs, also known as the cost of production, is calculated by adding all the costs involved in the manufacturing process. This is equal to the sum of the prime costs, in other words, direct material plus direct labor plus any other direct costs, and the manufacturing overheads, like the water and electricity and the depreciation that's related to the manufacturing process. So in equation form, total manufacturing cost is our prime cost plus the manufacturing overheads. Then we have the concept of a unit cost. Unit, we think of one unit. The unit cost of a product is calculated by dividing the total manufacturing costs by the total number of units produced. So in equation form, the unit cost of a product is the total manufacturing costs divided by the number of units produced. So let's illustrate this by way of an example. In March 2017, Pants Up manufacturers produced 2,000 leather belts. The following is the list of the costs they incurred during the month. The leather used for the belts, 30,000. The buckles used for the belts, 5,000. Wages paid to the leather cutters, 9,000. Wages paid to the sewing machine operator, 16,000. Rent paid for hiring of sewing machines, 12,000. Salary paid to the factory supervisor, 8,000. Other general overheads, 20,000. We have to use the given information to calculate firstly the direct material costs. So the direct material costs will be the leather used for the belts, and then also the buckles used for the belts. We can identify it, we can see it, and it is a significant enough portion or amount or cost to see it as part of the direct material costs. So it's the 30,000 plus the 5,000. Next we have to focus on the direct labor costs. So the leather cutters will definitely touch the leather that they cut. So it's touch labor, it should form part of the direct labor costs. The sewing machine operators, they will also definitely touch the material as it goes through the sewing machine, so that's also touch labor. But the factory supervisor doesn't really touch the products, so that salary is not part of the direct labor, because the supervisor more looks that all the other workers are doing their job properly and get involved when there are problems and help to solve problems. So therefore, it's only those two categories that form part of the direct labor, the wages of the cutters, the wages of the sewing machine operators, which are 9,000 and 16,000, which if we add provides 25,000. Next we have our prime costs, which we know by definition is simply our direct material plus direct labor and any other direct costs, but I don't see any other direct costs. So direct material of 35, direct labor of 25 we have to add together, and that will provide 60,000 as a total. Number 4, the manufacturing overhead. So it's the things that we cannot directly identify in the product or which is small or insignificant in terms of the costs. So in this specific case, we have the rent paid for hiring of the sewing machines. Okay, so that's not like direct costs. And then we have other general overheads. And then also we have the salary of the supervisor, because that was not direct labor, it was indirect labor. Because remember, we have to take the indirect material, indirect labor, and any other cost that is not direct material and direct labor to get the manufacturing overheads. So we have the rent for the sewing machines, we have the salary paid for the supervisor, and then we have the general ones. So we can add the 12,000, the 8,000 and the 20,000 to obtain 40,000. Now we're in a position to calculate the total manufacturing cost, which we know by definition is simply the prime cost, which we calculated in 3, plus the manufacturing overheads, which we calculated in 4. So we have to add the 60,000 plus the 40,000, which will result in 100,000 rands worth of manufacturing costs. Now we need to calculate the unit cost of a leather belt. So unit, we think of 1. So how much does it cost for one leather belt? It's simply the total manufacturing cost as calculated in 5 divided by the number of belts. And we produce 2,000, so it's the 100,000 divided by the 2,000. The total manufacturing cost of 100,000 divided by the number of units of 2,000, which will give us 50 rand. So it costs us 50 rand to produce one leather belt. Finally, the selling price of the leather belt, if pants up manufacturers use a profit markup of 60% on costs. So we know it's 50 rand is the 100%, we have to add 60%. So it's the cost price plus the profit markup. So on the 50 rand, which is 100%, we still have to calculate a 60%, which is 30. So 50 plus 30 will give us 80 rand.